During the official inaugural festivities in Washington, a cruel social line was drawn. Although Floyd Calhoun, the vice president's wife, was not yet in the Capitol, her spirit of rejection ruled the room like a command. Taking their cue from the top, the cabinet wives deliberately gathered their skirts and turned their backs as Peggy approached. The rejection was contagious. No one clinked glasses, no one spoke, and the women treated her as if she were invisible. Even while standing next to President Jackson, Peggy was forced to endure this suffocating silence, facing a public humiliation at the very center of American power. President Jackson's rage over this treatment was explosive, leading him to eventually dissolve almost his entire cabinet just to defend her honor. Powerful ministers were forced to resign and leave Washington simply because they refused to defy their wives' social boycott. But before she became the woman who shattered a presidency and purged the government, who was Peggy Eaton, and what buried secrets made her such a target? Washington, D.C. in the early 1800s was not the grand city it claimed to be. On the official maps, it looked impressive, filled with wide avenues and ambitious plans. But in reality, it was a chaotic, sickness-filled swamp. It was often called a capital of miserable huts, where powerful senators had to live in crowded rooms like college students, and the government operated out of buildings that were only half finished. It was a rough, transient world dominated by men, smelling of horse manure, tobacco smoke, and raw sewage. In this harsh environment, where a person's reputation was the only thing that mattered, Margaret Peggy O'Neill was born. She would grow up to cause a scandal that tore the government apart. She was born on December 3rd, 1799, not in a manor house or a plantation, but in a tavern. Her father, William O'Neill, was an exuberant Irishman who had established the Franklin House on I Street. It was not merely an inn, it was the unofficial dormitory of the United States Congress. Because the city lacked housing, lawmakers left their families back in their home states and lived in boarding houses like O'Neill's for months at a time. They ate at communal tables, drank in the parlor, and debated the fate of the nation in the hallways. Peggy O'Neill did not grow up playing with dolls in a nursery. She grew up passing plates of roast beef to Henry Clay. She grew up pouring wine for Daniel Webster. She was a child of the tavern, raised in the thick cigar smoke of political intrigue. While other girls of her era were being trained in silence, embroidery, and the art of being decorative shadows, Peggy was being educated by the most powerful men in America. She was a prodigy of this environment. By the time she was 12, she was not only serving these men, but conversing with them. She had a sharp, agile mind that delighted the lonely congressmen missing their own daughters. They indulged her, debated with her, and treated her more like a favorite niece than a servant. William O'Neill, doting and perhaps too permissive, hired top tutors for her. She learned French, she mastered the piano, and she studied history. But her true classroom was the dining room of the Franklin House. There, she learned the cadence of political speech. She learned that a man's public face often contradicted his private vices. She learned that power was not just laws and treaties, but whispers, favors, and leverage. This upbringing created a woman who was chemically incompatible with the era she lived in. In the 1820s, a respectable woman was demure, pious, and submissive. Peggy was none of these things. She was loud, opinionated, dangerously intelligent, and undeniably sensual. She looked men in the eye when she spoke to them. She laughed with her head thrown back. To the men of the Franklin House, she was a delight, a lush little piece of womanhood, as one observer crudely noted. To the aristocratic women of Washington society, the wives who occasionally visited the Capitol, she was something else entirely. She was Pothouse Peg. She was a serving girl with airs. She was a violation of the class structure. They sensed in her a refusal to know her place, and they hated her for it long before she ever met Andrew Jackson. Peggy's romantic life began with the same turbulence that would define her later years. She was beautiful, possessing a dark, vibrant allure that drew men like moths to a lantern. The boarding house was a dangerous place for a teenage girl brimming with hormones and lacking a mother's strict supervision. Her mother, Rhoda, was present but often overshadowed by the boisterous atmosphere of the inn. By age 14, Peggy was already the subject of gossip. There were whispers of stolen kisses in the pantry and flirtations that went beyond the bounds of propriety. In a dramatic episode that foreshadowed her future recklessness, she attempted to elope with an army officer. Accounts vary on the man's name. Some say a Major Belton, others a Captain Root. But the outcome was the same. She climbed out of her window, driven by the romantic novel she devoured, only to be intercepted. The escape was thwarted. Legend says she knocked over a flower pot, alerting her father, and the O'Neills quickly realized their daughter was a powder keg, waiting for a match. Desperate to secure her reputation, the O'Neills pushed for a respectable marriage. In 1816, at the age of 17, Peggy stood at the altar with John B. Timberlake. On paper, Timberlake was a catch. He was a purser in the United States Navy, a position that carried the veneer of officer status and a steady income. He was handsome, dashing in his uniform, and seemed to offer Peggy a ticket out of the tavern and into the ranks of the respectable middle class. The reality, however, was a nightmare. John Timberlake was a weak man. He was charming but fundamentally incompetent with money and prone to heavy drinking. The life of a naval purser involved long, agonizing separations. For months, sometimes years, Peggy was left alone in Washington with their children. She bore 3, losing one in infancy, leaving her with 2 daughters, Virginia and Margaret. During Timberlake's absences, the veneer of the respectable naval wife began to crack. Timberlake's business ventures, often funded by loans he couldn't repay, failed spectacularly. Instead of living in a home of her own, Peggy found herself back at the Franklin house, helping her father run the tavern to support her children and her absent, debt-ridden husband. She was a married woman living the life of a single girl, surrounded by transient men, with a husband thousands of miles away. It was a recipe for disaster. In 1818, 2 years into Peggy's troubled marriage, a new boarder arrived at the Franklin house. He was 28 years old, a wealthy widower, and a newly elected senator from Tennessee. His name was John Henry Eaton. Eaton was not just another politician. He was the alter ego of General Andrew Jackson. He had served under Jackson during the Creek War and had written the general's biography, a hagiography that helped propel Jackson to national stardom. Where Jackson was rough, fiery, and uncouth, Eaton was polished, diplomatic, and smooth. He was the velvet glove to Jackson's iron fist. John Eaton took an immediate interest in the young, struggling Timberlake family. He was wealthy, lonely, and captivated by the vivacious Peggy. But, crucially, he also befriended John Timberlake. When Timberlake was home, Eaton became a fixture in their lives. Seeing the crushing weight of debt that was destroying the purser, Eaton intervened. He didn't just lend them money, he effectively bankrupted himself trying to save them. He bought the Franklin house when William O'Neill faced foreclosure. He paid off Timberlake's creditors. He used his influence in the Senate to petition for better postings for Timberlake. To a modern observer, this level of financial entanglement looks suspicious. To the cynics of 1820s Washington, it was an admission of guilt. Why would a U.S. senator spend thousands of dollars to bail out a lowly naval purser? The answer, the gossips concluded, was Peggy. The rumor mill began to grind. It was whispered that Eaton had bought Timberlake's silence. The story went that the senator had paid off the husband's debts in exchange for unfettered access to the wife. When Timberlake was sent away to the Mediterranean on the USS Constitution, a deployment Eaton helped arrange, the whispers turned into a roar. With her husband at sea, Peggy and Eaton were inseparable. They were seen riding in open carriages along Pennsylvania Avenue. They attended the theater together. Eaton was the protector of the O'Neill household, the surrogate father to Peggy's children, and the constant companion of a woman who was legally married to another man. Peggy, true to her nature, refused to hide. She saw no reason to be ashamed. Eaton was their benefactor, their landlord, and their dearest friend. In her mind, she was innocent. She was simply enjoying the company of an intellectual equal who treated her with kindness. She underestimated the malice of the city she lived in. She did not understand that in Washington, the appearance of sin was far more damaging than sin itself. The situation reached its breaking point in 1828. It was a year of extreme tension in America. The presidential election was underway, a brutal rematch between the incumbent John Quincy Adams and the populist challenger Andrew Jackson. It was the nastiest campaign in American history, characterized by mudslinging that makes modern politics look polite. In the midst of this political hurricane, news arrived from the Mediterranean that shattered Peggy's world. John Timberlake was dead. He had died aboard the USS Constitution on April 2nd, 1828. The official naval surgeon's report was clear. The cause of death was pulmonary disease, likely exacerbated by asthma and the harsh conditions of naval life. But Washington did not care about official reports. Washington preferred a scandal. Almost immediately, a darker, more sinister narrative took hold. The rumor spread that Timberlake had not died of disease. The gossips claimed he had cut his own throat. They whispered that he had died of a broken heart, driven to suicide after discovering proof of his wife's affair with John Eaton. There was no evidence for this. Timberlake had a long history of poor health and was known to be a hypochondriac. His financial failures weighed heavily on him. But the suicide theory was too delicious to ignore. It transformed Peggy O'Neill from a flirtatious tavern girl into a femme fatale, a black widow who had cuckolded her husband and driven him to his grave. She was 29 years old, a widow with 2 children, and the subject of the most vicious slander the Capitol had ever seen. While Peggy mourned in Washington, another tragedy was unfolding in Tennessee, one that would link her fate inextricably to the next president of the United States. Andrew Jackson won the election of 1828, a victory for the common man against the established elites. But the victory came at a terrible cost. During the campaign, the Adams faction had discovered an irregularity in Jackson's marriage to his beloved wife, Rachel. Years prior, Rachel had married Jackson believing her first husband had divorced her. He hadn't. Technically, for a brief period, Rachel Jackson had been a bigamist. The press tore her apart. They called her a whore, an adulteress, and a convicted criminal. Rachel, a pious and gentle woman who wanted nothing to do with politics, was devastated. The stress broke her heart. In December 1828, just weeks before her husband was to be inaugurated, Rachel Jackson collapsed and died. Andrew Jackson arrived in Washington not as a triumphant victor, but as a grieving, furious widower. He wore a black armband and carried a heart made of stone. He believed with every fiber of his being that the Washington elites had murdered his wife with their lies. He entered the White House with a singular burning vendetta. He would destroy the system that had destroyed Rachel. And then he looked at his friend John Eaton. He saw Eaton in love with Peggy O'Neill. He saw the same whispers, the same sneers, the same accusations of adultery being hurled at Peggy that had been hurled at Rachel. Jackson did not see Peggy O'Neill as a liability. He saw her as a proxy. Defending Peggy became a way to defend the memory of his dead wife. When Eaton came to the president-elect and asked for his advice on marrying Peggy, Jackson didn't hesitate. A more cautious politician would have told Eaton to wait, to let the mourning period pass, to let the rumors die down. Jackson did the opposite. "Major," he famously growled, "if you love the woman, marry her and damn the gossips." It was a command that would doom his administration. On January 1st, 1829, just 9 months after John Timberlake's death, Peggy O'Neill married John Henry Eaton. It was a breach of social protocol so severe it drew gasps from the establishment. A widow was expected to mourn for 2 years. 9 months was an insult to the dead, but the real shock came weeks later. Andrew Jackson released his list of cabinet appointments. He named John Henry Eaton as his Secretary of War. The tavern girl was now a cabinet wife. According to the strict rules of protocol, she was now outranked only by the vice president's wife. The ladies of Washington, the grand dames who had looked down on Pothouse Peg for decades, would now be required to call upon her, to sip tea in her parlor, and to treat her as an equal. They decided in a collective, silent pact of steel and lace that they would do no such thing. The stage was set for a war that would be fought not with cannons, but with calling cards. As the new year of 1829 dawned, the battle lines were drawn in invisible ink across the social map of the capital. The elevation of a tavern girl to the cabinet was seen not merely as a breach of etiquette, but as an invasion of the aristocratic sanctum by the uncouth forces of Jacksonian democracy. The air in Washington was thick with anticipation not just for the new presidency, but for the inevitable collision between the rough-hewn loyalty of Andrew Jackson and the rigid, unforgiving steel of Washington society. The explosion would not be long in coming, and it would begin the moment the new administration threw open its doors. The inauguration of Andrew Jackson in 1829 was supposed to be a celebration of democracy. It was the people's inauguration, a chaotic, raucous affair where frontiersmen in buckskins mingled with the Washington elite, trashing the White House furniture in their exuberance to see their hero. But while the mob drank punch and broke china downstairs, a far colder, more precise form of violence was being organized in the drawing rooms of the Capitol's aristocracy. The target was not the president, but the woman standing near him, the new Secretary of War's wife, Peggy Eaton. To modernize, the petticoat affair can seem like a trivial dispute over etiquette, a case of mean girls in corsets. This view is a mistake. In the 19th century, before women had the vote or the right to hold office, the social sphere was their political arena. The social call was not a leisure activity, it was the mechanism by which power was distributed. When a new administration arrived, the wives of the cabinet members formed a hierarchy. They were expected to visit one another, leaving engraved calling cards on silver trays. To accept a card and return the visit was to grant political legitimacy. To refuse a card, to look at a woman's name and instruct the servant to say Mrs. X is not at home, was a deliberate act of political excommunication. It signaled that the person was invisible, their influence null and void. In the spring of 1829, the most powerful women in America weaponized this system against Peggy Eaton. Every war has two generals. On one side stood Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, armed with the executive power of the United States. On the other stood a woman who possessed a weapon Jackson could not counter, absolute social authority. Her name was Floride Calhoun. Floride was the wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun. She was the antithesis of Peggy Eaton. Born into the highest tier of the South Carolina Slavocracy, she was a cousin to her husband and a woman of terrifying rigidity. She was pious, severe, and obsessed with the preservation of class distinctions. To Floride, the rise of Andrew Jackson, a rough-hewn duelist with a questionable background, was already a sign of America's moral decay. But the elevation of Peggy Eaton was an affront she could not tolerate. Floride viewed Peggy not just as loose, but as a contaminant. She believed that accepting a woman of easy virtue into the inner circle would degrade the moral fabric of the entire nation. If the wife of the Secretary of War was a former tavern girl who had slept with boarders, what did that say about the dignity of the Republic? Floride fired the opening salvo. When the Eatons made their required social call to the vice president's residence, Floride Calhoun refused to receive them. She did not return the visit. It was a public slap in the face. Taking their cue from the vice president's wife, the other cabinet wives fell in line. Mrs. Ingham, wife of the Treasury Secretary, Mrs. Branch, wife of the Navy Secretary, and Mrs. Berrien, wife of the Attorney General, formed a solid phalanx of rejection. They referred to themselves as the moral guardians of the administration. They called Peggy the Bellona, the Roman goddess of war, and pledged that she would never cross their thresholds. The humiliation was systematic. When Peggy entered a ballroom, conversation would stop. Women would physically turn their backs, gathering their skirts close to their bodies, as if avoiding a leper. At dinner parties where protocol demanded she be seated, women would feign illness and leave rather than break bread with her. Peggy, possessing the pride of the O'Neills, tried to hold her head high. She dressed in the finest silks, wore the brightest jewels, and smiled through the silence. But the isolation was crushing. She was a woman who thrived on conversation and wit, now trapped in a glass box of silence. If the attacks had come only from the cabinet wives, Andrew Jackson might have been able to dismiss them as the snobbery of his enemies. But the Eaton malaria, as the scandal came to be known, infected the White House itself. Jackson, a widower, needed an official hostess to manage the social functions of the presidency. He chose his niece, Emily Donaldson. Emily was young, only 21, and had grown up on a Tennessee plantation. She loved her Uncle Andrew dearly, but she was also terrifyingly insecure about her new role in Washington. When Emily arrived in the capital, she looked for guidance. She found it in Floride Calhoun. The vice president's wife took the young First Lady surrogate under her wing, mentoring her on the nuances of Washington society. The primary lesson she imparted was simple: you cannot associate with Peggy Eaton. Emily was torn. On one hand, her uncle commanded her to visit Peggy. On the other, the arbiter of society told her that doing so would ruin her own reputation. Emily chose society. When Jackson realized that his own niece was part of the boycott, his fury was apocalyptic. The domestic atmosphere of the White House turned toxic. Dinner conversations were tense interrogations. "Did you visit Mrs. Eaton today?" Jackson would demand. Emily would look at her plate and refuse to answer. Jackson saw this defiance as a betrayal of the highest order. To him, Emily was not just snubbing Peggy. She was siding with the murderers of his wife, Rachel. He raged at her, lectured her, and eventually, putting loyalty to Peggy above his own family, he banished her back to Tennessee. "I will not be dictated to by the women of this capital," he roared, pounding the table. But the women of the capital knew something. Jackson didn't. He could command armies. He could veto laws. But he could not force a woman to drink tea with someone she despised. By the autumn of 1829, the government of the United States was paralyzed. Cabinet meetings, which should have been focused on Indian removal policies, the national bank, or tariffs, devolved into icy silences. The secretaries whose wives were shunning Peggy, Ingham, Branch, and Berrien, sat stone-faced, refusing to make eye contact with Eaton. Eaton, simmering with rage and humiliation, looked ready to challenge them to duels. Andrew Jackson decided to settle the matter once and for all. He would hold a trial. He spent weeks gathering evidence. The President of the United States turned into a private investigator. He dispatched agents to New York and Philadelphia to interview hotel clerks where Peggy and Eaton had stayed years prior. He hunted down guest registries to prove they had slept in separate rooms. He tracked down rumors about a supposed miscarriage Peggy had suffered, finding a doctor who swore it was a legitimate medical issue, not a pregnancy. Once his dossier was complete, Jackson summoned his cabinet. It was perhaps the most bizarre cabinet meeting in American history. At 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening, the most powerful men in the country gathered in the White House library. There was no agenda regarding the economy or foreign affairs. The sole topic was the sexual history of Margaret O'Neill Eaton. Jackson stood at the head of the table, his gaunt face pale with intensity. He slammed his dossier onto the wood. "She is as chaste as a virgin," he declared, a line that must have caused uncomfortable shifting among the men who knew Peggy had been married for years and had children. For hours, Jackson read aloud from affidavits. He presented proof that Peggy had not slept with Eaton before marriage. He refuted the claims that her first child was illegitimate. He practically diagrammed the layout of the Franklin house to show that her bedroom was not accessible to boarders. It was a spectacle of delusion. Jackson believed that facts could conquer gossip. He believed that if he proved Peggy was technically innocent, the wives would have to accept her. He was wrong. The cabinet members sat in stunned silence. When Jackson finished his defense and demanded that they control their wives, the men balked. "Mr. President," one secretary stammered, "I can control my department, but I cannot control my wife." The meeting ended in failure. The breach was total. The administration was split into two warring camps: the Eatonites, loyal to Jackson, and the anti-Eatonites, loyal to Calhoun and the societal norms. The business of the nation ground to a halt. Into this deadlock stepped a short, balding man with red sideburns and a permanent, enigmatic smile. Martin Van Buren, the Secretary of State, was the only member of the cabinet who was not paralyzed by the affair. Van Buren was a political genius, known as the Little Magician, for his ability to make problems disappear and votes appear. He had two distinct advantages in the Eaton War. First, he was a widower. He had no wife to forbid him from socializing with Peggy. He was a free agent in the drawing rooms of Washington. Second, he was ambitious. He saw what Calhoun, in his aristocratic arrogance, had missed. The road to the presidency did not run through the approval of Floyd Calhoun. It ran through the heart of Andrew Jackson. Van Buren launched a charm offensive. While the other secretaries turned their backs, Van Buren offered Peggy his arm at dinners. He sat by her side and engaged her in lively conversation about French literature and politics. He organized lavish parties at the State Department and made Peggy the guest of honor, seating her at his right hand. It was a masterstroke. Peggy, starved for kindness and intellectual stimulation, blossomed under his attention. She wrote to Jackson praising Van Buren's chivalry. Jackson watched this with immense gratitude. In the lonely, besieged atmosphere of the White House, Van Buren became his only true confidant. Jackson began to see Van Buren not just as a skilled politician, but as a loyal son, the only man who respected his judgment and his friends. A clear dichotomy formed. John C. Calhoun, the vice president, was the face of the opposition, the man whose wife was leading the torture of Peggy. Martin Van Buren was the face of loyalty. The petticoat affair had effectively destroyed the alliance between Jackson and Calhoun. They had been elected as a ticket, but they were now enemies. Calhoun, once the heir apparent to the presidency, found himself frozen out of the inner circle. He retreated to the Senate, his presidential ambitions withering with every snub his wife delivered to Peggy Eaton. As 1830 dragged on, the scandal metastasized. It was no longer just about gossip. It was affecting national policy. The tension between Jackson and Calhoun, fueled by the Eaton affair, spilled over into the nullification crisis. Calhoun, alienated from the president, began to champion the idea that states had the right to nullify federal laws they disagreed with, a doctrine that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Historians have long argued that if Calhoun had remained in Jackson's inner circle, if the two men had remained friends, the course of Southern radicalism might have been checked. Instead, the breach over Peggy Eaton pushed Calhoun toward extremism. Meanwhile, the press was having a field day. Opposition newspapers published cartoons mocking the petticoat cabinet. They depicted Jackson as a senile old man being led by the nose by a scarlet woman. The administration was becoming a laughingstock. Jackson was exhausted. His health, never robust, was failing under the stress. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the political opposition and one against the social circle of his own capital. He needed a way out. He needed a reset. But how could he fire the cabinet members who snubbed Peggy without admitting that a woman had brought down his government? He couldn't just fire them for their wives' behavior. It would look petty and tyrannical. He needed a sacrifice. And once again, the little magician had a plan. Van Buren's scheme was a gamble of the highest order, requiring a level of political suicide that few men would dare consider. He understood that to save the presidency, he had to destroy the cabinet, and to do that, he had to be the first to fall. It was a maneuver that required silence, timing, and absolute trust from a president who was known for his volatility. As the winter turned to spring, the pieces were quietly moved into place for a political detonation that would clear the air of the Eaton malaria once and for all. By the spring of 1831, the United States government was effectively decapitated. The Eaton malaria had festered for 2 years, turning the cabinet into a nest of vipers. President Andrew Jackson, a man who had defeated the British Empire and the Creek Nation, found himself defeated by a coalition of angry wives. He could not pass legislation, he could not trust his advisors, and he could not restore peace to his own household. The stalemate seemed unbreakable. Jackson would not fire John Eaton, as that would be admitting defeat and branding Peggy a fallen woman. He could not fire the anti-Eaton secretaries, Ingham, Branch, and Berrien, without a valid political reason, lest he look like a tyrant purging men over a tea party. The administration was drifting toward a cliff. It was Martin Van Buren who provided the parachute. In April 1831, during one of his daily horseback rides with the president into the woods around Washington, Van Buren proposed a solution so radical and counterintuitive that it stunned Jackson. "I will resign," Van Buren said. Jackson initially refused. Van Buren was his most loyal lieutenant, the only competent man in the room. Losing him seemed like suicide, but Van Buren, with his lawyerly precision, explained the trap he was setting. If Van Buren and John Eaton both resigned voluntarily, it would dissolve the cabinet. It would create a vacancy at the top that would necessitate a complete reorganization. Jackson would then be free to request the resignations of the remaining cabinet members, the Calhoun faction, not because their wives were mean to Peggy, but because the president was forming a new administration for the second half of his term. It was a masterstroke of political theater. It framed the purge as a routine restructuring rather than a social vendetta. Eaton, exhausted by the constant abuse and eager to shield his wife from further attacks, agreed to the plan. He understood that his presence was the anchor dragging the presidency down. The plan was executed with military precision. In April 1831, the newspapers carried the shocking announcement: the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War had resigned. The Washington establishment barely had time to process this news before the axe fell on the rest. Jackson sent letters to Samuel Ingham, John Branch, and John Berrien, coldly requesting their resignations. The shock was absolute. Never before in American history had a president fired his entire cabinet. It was a massacre. The anti-Eaton triumvirate was stunned. They had believed they were untouchable, protected by their powerful political bases and the moral high ground of their wives. Now they were unemployed. The Petticoat Affair had claimed its final political victims. The purge cleared the board. Jackson was free to appoint a new cabinet, one composed of loyalists who owed nothing to John C. Calhoun. For Calhoun, the purge was a death sentence for his presidential ambitions. He had assumed he would succeed Jackson. Instead, he watched helplessly as Martin Van Buren, the man who had been kind to Peggy Eaton, was elevated to the position of vice president in 1832 and anointed as Jackson's heir. It is no exaggeration to say that the American Civil War's prelude was written in these months. Calhoun, humiliated and cut off from federal power, retreated to South Carolina. His dreams of the White House shattered by a tavern keeper's daughter, he turned his brilliant, resentful mind toward the doctrine of nullification and states' rights. If he could not rule the Union, he would create the legal framework to dismantle it. With the cabinet dissolved, the immediate pressure on Peggy Eaton vanished, but so did her protection. The Eatons needed to leave Washington. The city was still toxic with resentment, and the gossip, though no longer a matter of state security, was as vicious as ever. Jackson, ever the loyal friend, would not let John Eaton go without a reward. He appointed Eaton as the governor of the Florida Territory. It was a form of exile, but a dignified one. In 1834, John and Peggy traveled south to Tallahassee. Florida was a wild, humid frontier, a far cry from the drawing rooms of D.C., but for Peggy, it was a relief. Here, she was the governor's lady. The social circles were smaller, less rigid, and more dependent on her husband's favor. Yet Florida was too small for a woman of Peggy's energy. She found the frontier stifling. She missed the electricity of the capital, the music, the debates. She was a creature of the city, and the swamps of Tallahassee held little charm. After 2 years, they returned to Washington, but they did not stay long. Jackson had one final gift for the couple who had suffered so much for him. In 1836, he appointed John Eaton as the United States Minister to Spain. This appointment would lead to the happiest, most triumphant chapter of Peggy Eaton's life. Europe was a revelation. In the 1830s, the courts of Europe operated on a completely different set of social coordinates than the puritanical circles of Washington. In D.C., a woman was judged by her sexual purity and her father's lineage. In Madrid, a woman was judged by her charm, her wit, and her ability to navigate the complex etiquette of the court. Peggy Eaton arrived in Madrid not as a suspect woman, but as the beautiful wife of the American envoy. The Spanish aristocracy did not know or did not care about the gossip of boarding houses. They saw a woman with dark, flashing eyes, a voluptuous figure, and a sharp tongue who spoke excellent French. She was a sensation. Peggy became a favorite of the Spanish court. She struck up a genuine friendship with the Queen Mother, Maria Cristina. They were kindred spirits, both strong women who had survived scandal and political turmoil. For 4 years, Peggy lived the life she had always been denied in America. She hosted grand balls where no one turned their back on her. She attended the opera in the royal box. She navigated diplomatic disputes with a natural grace that surprised her husband's detractors. The tavern girl proved to be a more effective diplomat than many of the Ivy League-educated men who had scorned her. Her daughters, Virginia and Margaret, flourished in this environment. Freed from the stigma of their mother's reputation, they were courted by European nobility. Virginia eventually married the Duke de Sampaio, cementing the family's rise into the European aristocracy. In Madrid, Peggy Eaton finally won. She proved that her exclusion in Washington was not due to her lack of refinement, but due to the provincial narrow-mindedness of her enemies. When she was treated with respect, she acted with dignity. The Eatons returned to the United States in 1840. The political landscape had changed. Andrew Jackson had retired to the Hermitage in Tennessee. Martin Van Buren was president, though struggling with an economic depression. The heat of the Petticoat affair had cooled into historical trivia. John and Peggy settled back into Washington, but this time they lived on the periphery of power. They were wealthy, comfortable, and older. They built a large home and lived a life of quiet luxury. John Eaton, once the firebrand senator, became a respected elder statesman. He practiced law, managed his investments, and enjoyed the peace that had eluded him during his cabinet years. He remained devoted to Peggy until the end. When John Eaton died in 1856, he left Peggy a very wealthy widow. She was 56 years old. She owned prime real estate in Washington, had a substantial fortune in bonds, and possessed a jewelry box filled with gems from her days in Madrid. By all accounts, the story should have ended here. It would have been a satisfying conclusion. The persecuted woman outlives her enemies, finds happiness abroad, and retires in comfort. But Peggy O'Neill was not designed for a quiet ending. She was a woman who had always been defined by her relationships with men. Her father, her first husband, her second husband, the president. Now, for the first time in her life, she was alone. Her daughters were married and living their own lives. Her protectors were dead. She was rich, she was lonely, and she still possessed the impulsive, romantic heart of the girl who had tried to climb out of a window at 14. The tragedy that followed would be far more personal and far more devastating than any political snub. It would not involve the fate of the nation, but it would break her in a way the Calhouns never could. In 1859, 3 years after burying the love of her life, Peggy O'Neill Eaton walked into a dance studio in Washington, D.C. to watch her grandchildren's lessons. There she met the instructor. His name was Antonio Gabriele Buccignani. He was Italian, he was handsome, he was charming, and he was 19 years old. The introduction of this young dancing master marked the end of Peggy's long, hard-won peace. For nearly 2 decades, she had successfully navigated the world as a respected diplomat's wife and a dignified widow, silencing her critics with her resilience. But the heart that had once defied a presidency was still beating with a reckless, youthful cadence that belied her graying hair. In the twilight of her life, Peggy was about to make a choice that would prove she had lost none of her impulsiveness, nor her tragic capacity for trusting the wrong men. History is often kind to the young and tragic, but it is merciless to the old and foolish. Peggy Eaton had survived the vitriol of the most powerful women in America. She had survived the death of 2 husbands. She had survived the intrigues of the Spanish court. She had proven herself to be a woman of steel, but steel can become brittle with age, and the loneliness of a wealthy widow is a vulnerability that no political acumen can protect against. In 1859, Peggy Eaton was 59 years old. By the standards of the mid-19th century, she was an old woman. She was the matriarch of a respectable clan, grandmother to a brood of children who were now entering society themselves. She lived in a mansion on I Street surrounded by the ghosts of her past glory. Washington had changed. The fiery Jacksonian era was over. The country was careening toward the Civil War. Peggy was a relic, a living museum piece who could regale dinner guests with stories of General Jackson and the old Hickory days. But beneath the comfortable exterior, the fire still burned. She was still Peggy O'Neill, impulsive, passionate, and desperately in need of adoration. It was this need that led her to the dance studio of Antonio Gabriele Buccignani. Antonio Buccignani was an Italian immigrant, a dancing master who made his living teaching the waltz and the cotillion to the children of Washington's elite. He was 19 years old, younger than Peggy's own children, younger even than some of her grandchildren. He was handsome, possessing a dark Mediterranean charm that perhaps reminded Peggy of her days in Madrid. He was graceful, attentive, and poor. The attraction was immediate, and to society, grotesque. Peggy became infatuated. She saw in Buccignani a chance to recapture the youth that had been stolen from her by scandal and grief. He listened to her. He flattered her. He treated her not as an elderly widow, but as a desirable woman. For Buccignani, the attraction was likely far simpler. Peggy Eaton was one of the wealthiest women in Washington. The courtship was brief and scandalous. Her family was horrified. Her daughters, Virginia and Margaret, begged her to see reason. They pointed out the 40-year age difference. They pointed out that he was a dancing instructor, a profession not much higher than a servant in the social hierarchy. They warned her that he was a fortune hunter. Peggy ignored them all. Just as she had ignored the gossips in 1829, she ignored her family in 1859. She had always trusted her own heart over the advice of others. "I have lived my life according to my own judgment," she told them, "and I will not stop now." On June 7, 1859, Margaret O'Neill Timberlake Eaton married Antonio Gabriele Buccignani. The wedding was a sensation, but of a different kind than the Eaton marriage 30 years prior. That had been a political tragedy. This was a farce. The newspapers mocked the Union. Washington society, which had once feared Peggy, now pitied her. She was no longer the dangerous Bellona. She was the punchline of a joke about an old woman buying a young husband. For 7 years, the marriage existed in a strange, suspended reality. To the surprise of the naysayers, Antonio did not immediately flee. He settled into the life of a gentleman. Peggy, blinded by love or perhaps by a desperate refusal to admit she had been wrong, lavished everything upon him. She paid his debts. She bought him fine clothes. She set him up in business. She successfully petitioned the government to give him a position in the Library of Congress. She effectively handed him the keys to the Eaton fortune. In her mind, this was a partnership. She was the experienced, worldly woman guiding a young protégé. She wrote letters during this period that suggest a genuine happiness. She believed she was loved. But while Peggy was playing the role of the devoted wife, a much darker drama was unfolding under her own roof. Peggy was close to her grandchildren, particularly her granddaughter, Emily Randolph. Emily was the daughter of Peggy's eldest daughter, Virginia. In 1865, Emily was 17 years old, roughly the same age Peggy had been when she first married. She was young, impressionable, and lived in close proximity to her grandmother's dashing young Italian husband. The math was cruel. Antonio was now 26. Emily was 17. Peggy was 66. A triangle formed in the mansion on I Street, unseen by the aging Peggy. While she was tending to Antonio's needs and signing over deed transfers to him, Antonio was courting her granddaughter. The catastrophe struck in 1866. It was a betrayal so absolute, so symmetrical in its cruelty, that it feels like the plot of a Greek tragedy. Antonio Buccignani and Emily Randolph disappeared. They didn't just leave town, they fled to Europe, and they didn't just take their clothes. Antonio had spent the previous months systematically liquidating Peggy's assets. He had convinced her to transfer deeds into his name for business purposes. He had accessed her bank accounts. When he boarded the steamer for New York and then Italy, he took Peggy's granddaughter, and he took Peggy's fortune. Peggy was left with nothing. The emotional devastation is difficult to quantify. To lose a husband to a younger woman is a cliché. To lose a husband to one's own granddaughter is a trauma that defies language. It was a total invalidation of her life, her judgment, and her family legacy. The girl she had bounced on her knee had stolen the man she slept beside. Washington held its breath. The woman who had fought Andrew Jackson's cabinet, who had stared down Floyd Calhoun, was finally broken. The last chapter of Peggy Eaton's life was a slow, agonizing slide into poverty and obscurity. She filed for divorce, which was granted in 1869. The court proceedings were humiliating, airing the dirty laundry of the theft and the incestuous nature of the betrayal. She regained her name. She was Mrs. Eaton again, but she could not regain her money. Buccignani and Emily were in Italy, spending the Eaton fortune on a lavish lifestyle that Peggy had paid for. Justice, in a grim form, would eventually catch up to them. Emily and Antonio would later return to America, but their stolen happiness was short-lived. It is said that Antonio eventually squandered the money and abandoned Emily as well, proving that a man who will rob his wife will also rob his mistress. But for Peggy, retribution was cold comfort. She was forced to leave her mansion. She sold her jewelry piece by piece. The gems that had sparkled in the candlelit ballrooms of Madrid now sold to pawnbrokers to pay for room and board. She moved into Lochiel House, a modest boarding home for destitute women. The irony was bitter. She had been born in a tavern, raised in a hotel, and now, after rising to the heights of the White House and the Royal Palace of Spain, she was ending her days in a boarding house once again. The circle was complete. Yet even in poverty, the spark of Peggy O'Neill did not entirely vanish. In 1873, realizing that her story was being written by her enemies, she decided to write it herself. She picked up a pen and began to draft her autobiography. It is a remarkable document. Written by a woman in her 70s living in poverty, it does not read like a plea for pity. It reads like a closing argument. She dictates her version of history with a fiery, unrepentant voice. She insists on her innocence regarding the Eaton affair. She lashes out at the cats of Washington society who tried to destroy her. She defends Andrew Jackson. "I was not the cause of the trouble," she wrote. "I was the occasion for it." It was a profound insight. She understood in the end that she had been a symbol, a proxy in a war between powerful men. She tried to find a publisher, hoping the book would bring in some much-needed money. But the publishing houses of the 1870s were not interested. The Civil War had washed away the memory of the Petticoat affair. A scandal about a Jacksonian cabinet wife seemed like ancient history to a nation reconstructing after Gettysburg. The manuscript was rejected. It would sit in a drawer, gathering dust until it was finally published in 1932, over 50 years after her death. Peggy Eaton lived for 10 years after the divorce. She became a local character in Washington, a small, withered old woman dressed in threadbare black silk, walking the streets of the city she once ruled. Few recognized her. To the new generation of politicians, she was just another ghost of the antebellum past. A newspaper reporter who visited her in 1874 described her as having eyes that still hold the fire of youth. Even as her hands trembled, she told him, I have lived in the storm, sir. I am not afraid of the rain. She died on November 8th, 1879. She was just weeks shy of her 80th birthday. Her death was a quiet affair. There were no state funerals, no flags at half-mast. The government she had upended did not pause to mourn her. She was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown. In a final act of loyalty, or perhaps defiance, she was laid to rest next to John Henry Eaton. The inscription on her grave is simple. It does not mention the presidency, the scandal, or the dancing master. It simply records her name and dates. But the real epitaph of Peggy Eaton is not written in stone. It is written in the history of the American executive branch. As the earth settled over her grave, the Victorian era was coming to a close. The rigid social structures that had tried to crush her were slowly beginning to fracture. Peggy O'Neill had been born too early. In a different century, her intelligence, her ambition, and her refusal to apologize might have made her a CEO or a senator in her own right. In the 19th century, they made her a scandal. We must also reflect on what the scandal meant for women. In the early 19th century, women had no vote and no office. Their power was influence. They exerted control over the nation by controlling the social access of its leaders. The ladies of Washington were a formidable political bloc. The petticoat affair was a clash between the male political sphere and the female social sphere, and the men won. Jackson's victory, forcing the resignation of the cabinet to bypass the wives, was a crushing blow to the informal power of women in Washington. It signaled that the president would not be held hostage by the social register. For decades after the affair, the role of the cabinet wife was diminished. Women in Washington learned a harsh lesson. If they pushed too hard against the political machinery, the machinery would simply crush them. It would take generations for women to regain the level of implicit influence they held in the 1820s, and even longer to gain explicit power. Peggy Eaton herself was a paradox in this struggle. She was a woman who refused to conform to the rules of her gender, yet her survival depended entirely on the protection of powerful men. She was not a feminist hero in the modern sense. She did not fight for women's rights. She fought for her own right to be at the table. But in doing so, she exposed the hypocrisy of a system that demanded women be silent ornaments. Why does the story of Peggy Eaton still captivate us 2 centuries later? It is because the dynamics of the petticoat affair are timeless. We like to believe that politics is about high-minded debates over tax rates and foreign policy. Peggy Eaton reminds us that politics is often deeply, stupidly personal. We see the echoes of the Eaton affair every time a politician's family is scrutinized by the press. We see it in the character attacks that define modern campaigns. We see it in the way social cliques still form in the halls of power, deciding who is in and who is out. The tavern girl was the prototype for every outsider who ever tried to crash the gates of the establishment. She represented the messy, chaotic reality of democracy crashing into the rigid, polished walls of elitism. Jackson loved her because she was the people, flawed, loud, striving, and judged unfairly by the snobs. But looking back at the tapestry of her life, one is struck not by the tragedy, but by the vitality. Most people in history are gray blurs, census data, and tombstones. Peggy Eaton is Technicolor. She leaps off the page. She was a woman who forced the United States government to stop and look at her. She was the Bellona, the goddess of war. And like any war, she left a changed map in her wake. She proved that the personal is political. She proved that a whisper can scream louder than a cannon. And she proved that in the American story, it is often the people we try to exclude who end up defining us. The United States entered the 1830s as a collection of aristocratic fiefdoms. It left them as a rough and tumble democracy dominated by party loyalty. It entered with John C. Calhoun as the heir apparent. It left with him as the enemy of the state. It entered with the illusion of unity. It left with the battle lines of the Civil War drawn in the sand. All of this because the daughter of an innkeeper refused to stay in the kitchen.